How Top Labour Officials Plotted to Bring Down Jeremy Corbyn by Jonathan Cook, April 16, 2020. Leaked reports show that staff worked relentlessly to damage the party's leader, including by exploiting antisemitism. The findings of a leaked 160-page report compiled by the British Labour Party on its handling of antisemitism complaints is both deeply shocking and entirely predictable all at once. For the first time, extensive internal correspondence between senior party officials has been revealed, proving a years-long plot to destroy Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader who recently stepped down. The report confirms long-held suspicions that suspected cases of anti-Semitism were exploited by head office staff to try to undermine Corbyn. Anyone who was paying close attention to events in the party over the past 5 years already had a sense of that. But the depth of hostility from party managers towards Corbyn, to the extent that they actively sought to engineer his defeat in the 2017 general election, comes as a bombshell even to most veteran Labour watchers. As the report reveals, party managers and a substantial section of the Labour Parliamentary Party barely hid their contempt for Corbyn after he won the leadership election in 2015. They claimed he was incapable of winning power. These officials and MPs hankered for a return to a supposed golden era of Labour 20 years earlier, when Tony Blair had reinvented the party as New Labour, embracing Thatcherite economics but presented with a more caring face. At the time, it proved a winning formula, earning Blair 3 terms in office. Many of the officials and MPs most hostile to Corbyn had been selected or prospered under Blair. Because Corbyn sought to reverse the concessions made by New Labour to the political right, his democratic socialism was reviled by the Blairites. In 2017, one of the architects of New Labour, Peter Mandelson, unabashedly declared, quote, "I work every single day in some small way to bring forward the end of his, Corbyn's, tenure in office. Something, however small it may be, an email, a phone call, or a meeting I convene. Every day I try to do something to save the Labour Party from his leadership," end quote. The sentiment the report makes clear was widely shared at the highest levels of the party bureaucracy. Senior officials actively sought to sabotage Corbyn as leader at every turn. The Blairites found a plethora of self-serving reasons aggressively shared by the media for arguing that Corbyn was unfit for office. Those range from his unkempt appearance to his opposition to Britain's recent wars of aggression, resource grabs, repackaged as, quote, humanitarian interventions that had been a staple of the Blair years. Corbyn was falsely presented as having a treasonous past as a Soviet spy and of being, at the very least, indulgent of anti-Semitism. While members of Corbyn's inner circle were busy putting out these endless fires, the leaked reports showed that Labour officials were dedicating their time and energy to unseating him. Within a year, they had foisted upon him a rerun of leadership election. Corbyn won again with the overwhelming backing of members, even after party officials tried to rig the contest, as the report notes, by expelling thousands of members they feared would vote for him. Even this second victory failed to disarm the Blairites. They argued that what members found appealing in Corbyn would alienate the wider electorate, and so the covert campaign against the Labour leader intensified from within, as the extensive correspondence between party officials cited in the report makes clear. In fact, senior officials frantically tried to engineer a third leadership challenge in early 2017 on the back of what they expected to be a poor showing in 2 spring by-elections. The plan was to install one of their own, Tom Watson, Corbyn's hostile deputy, as interim leader. To their horror, Labour did well in the by-elections. Soon after, a general election was called. It is in these sections dealing with the June 2017 election that the report's most shocking revelations emerge. Again, assuming Labour would perform badly, senior staff drew up plans to stage yet another leadership challenge immediately after the election. Hoping to prove their odds, they proposed that an electoral college replace the one-member, one-vote system to ensure no left-wing candidates could win. These same staff had boasted of, quote, political fixing, end quote, and interfering in constituency parties to ensure Blairites were selected as parliamentary candidates rather than those sympathetic to Corbyn. It was already known that Labour was beset by factionalism at head office. At that time, some observers even referred to, quote, blue Labour, end quote, and red Labour, end quote, with the implication that, quote, blue, end quote, faction were really closet Tories. Few probably understood how close to the truth such remarks were. The dossier reveals that the Blairites in charge of the party machine continued undermining Corbyn even as it became clear they were wrong and that he could win the 2017 election. According to the report, correspondence between senior staff, including Labour's then General Secretary Ian McNicol, showed that there was no let-up in efforts to subvert Corbyn's campaign, even as the electoral tide turned in his favour. Rather than celebrating the fact that the electorate appeared to be warming to Corbyn when he finally had a chance to get his message out, during that short period when the broadcast media were forced to provide more balance, Labour officials frantically sent messages to each other, hoping he would still lose. When a poll showed the party surging, one official commented to a colleague, quote, I actually felt quite sick when I saw that YouGov poll last night, end quote. The colleague replied that, quote, with a bit of luck, end quote, there would soon be, quote, a clear polling decline, end quote. Excitedly, senior staff cited any outlier poll that suggested support for Corbyn was dropping, and they derided party figures, including shadow cabinet ministers such as Emily Thornberry, who offered anything more than formulaic support to Corbyn during the campaign. But this was not just sniping from the sidelines. Top staff actively worked to sabotage the campaign. Party bosses set up a secret operation, the, quote, key seat teams, end quote, in one of Labour offices, from which, according to the report, quote, a parallel general election campaign was run to support MPs associated with the right wing of the party, end quote. A senior official pointed to the, quote, need to throw cash, end quote, at the seat of Watson, Corbyn's deputy and major opponent. Corbyn's inner team found they were refused key information they needed to direct the campaign effectively. They were denied contact details for candidates, and many staff in HQ boasted that they spent the campaign, quote, doing nothing, end quote, or pretending to, quote, tap busily, end quote, at their computers while they plotted against Corbyn online. Writing this week, two left-wing Labour MPs, John Trickett and Ian Lavery, confirmed that efforts to undermine the 2017 election campaign were palpable at the time. Party officials, they said, denied both of them information and feedback they needed from doorstep activists to decide where resources would best be allocated and what messaging to use. It was, they wrote, suggested, quote, that we pour resources into seats with large Labour majorities, which were never under threat, end quote. The report and Trickett and Lavery's own description make clear the party managers wanted to ensure the party's defeat, while also shoring up the majorities of Labour's right-wing candidates to suggest that voters had preferred them. The aim of party managers was to ensure a Blairite takeover of the party immediately after the election was lost. It is therefore hardly surprising that when Corbyn overturned the Conservative majority and came within a hair's breadth of forming a government himself, there was an outpouring of anger and grief from senior staff. The message from one official cited in the report called the election result the, quote, opposite to what I have been working on towards for the last couple of years, end quote. She added that she and her colleagues were, quote, silent and grey-faced, end quote, and in, quote, need of counselling, end quote. Others said that they were, quote, stunned and reeling, end quote, and that they needed, quote, a safe space, end quote. They lamented that they would have to pretend to smile in front of the cameras. One observed, quote, we will have to suck this up "The people have spoken, bastards," end quote. Another tried to look at the bright side, quote, "At least we have loads of money now," end quote, a reference to the Jews from hundreds of thousands of new members Corbyn had attracted to the party as leader. In short, Labour's own party bosses not only secretly preferred a Conservative government, but actually worked hard to bring one about. The efforts to destroy Corbyn from 2015 through 2018 are the context for understanding the evolution of a widely accepted narrative about Labour becoming, quote, "institutionally anti-Semitic," end quote, under Corbyn's leadership. The chief purpose of the report is to survey this period and its relation to the anti-Semitism claims. As far as is known, the report was an effort to assess allegations that Labour had an identifiable, quote, anti-Semitism problem, end quote, under Corbyn, currently the subject of investigation by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. In a highly unusual move, the Commission launched an investigation of Labour last year. The only other political party ever to be investigated is the neo-Nazi British National Party a decade ago. The Labour report shows the party officials who helped the Tories to victory in 2017 were also the same people making sure anti-Semitism became a dark stain on Corbyn for most of his leadership. Confusingly, the report authors hedged their bets on the anti-Semitism claim, and on one hand, they argued that anti-Semitism complaints were handled no differently from other complaints in Labour, and could find no evidence that current or former staff were, quote, motivated by anti-Semitic intent, end quote. But at the same time, the report accepts that Labour had anti-Semitism problem beyond the presence of a few, quote, bad apples, end quote, despite the known statistical evidence refuting this. A Home Affairs Select Committee, a forum that was entirely unsympathetic to Corbyn, found in late 2016 that there was, quote, no reliable empirical evidence to support the notion that there is a higher prevalence of anti-Semitic attitudes within the Labour Party than any other political party, end quote. Even that assessment was unfair to Labour. Various surveys have suggested that Labour and the left have less of a problem with all forms of racism than the ruling Conservative Party. For those reasons alone, it was highly improper for the Equalities Commission to agree to investigate Labour. It smacks of the organisation's politicisation. Nonetheless, the decision of the report's authors to work within the parameters of the Equalities Watchdog's investigation is perhaps understandable. One of the successes of Corbyn's opponents has been to label any effort to challenge the claim that Labour has an anti-Semitism problem as, quote, denialism, end quote, and then cite these purported denialism as proof of anti-Semitism. Such self-rationalizing proofs are highly effective and a technique familiar from witch hunts and the McCarthy trials of the 1950s in the United States. The report highlights correspondence between senior staff showing that insofar as Labour had an, quote, anti-Semitism problem, end quote, it actually came from the Blairites in head office, not Corbyn or his team. It was party officials deeply hostile to Corbyn, after all, who were responsible for handling anti-Semitism complaints. These officials, the report notes, oversaw, quote, a litany of errors, end quote, and delays in the handling of complaints, not because they were anti-Semitic, but because they knew this was an effective way to further damage Corbyn. They intentionally expanded the scope of anti-Semitism investigations to catch out not only real anti-Semites in the party, but also members including Jews who shared Corbyn's support for Palestinian rights and were harshly critical of Israel. Later, this approach would be formalized with the party's adoption of a new definition of anti-Semitism proposed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, that shifted the focus from hatred of Jews to criticism of Israel. The complaint system was quickly overwhelmed, and delays worsened as officials hostile to Corbyn cynically dragged their heels to avoid resolving outstanding cases, or as the report stiffly describes it, there was, quote, abundant evidence of hyper-factional atmosphere prevailing in Party HQ, end quote, against Corbyn that, quote, affected the expeditious and resolute handling of disciplinary complaints, end quote. The report accuses McNichol of intentionally misleading Corbyn about the number of cases so that, quote, the scale of the problem was not appreciated, end quote, by his team, though the scale of the problem had in fact also been inflated by party officials. The report concludes that Sam Matthews, who oversaw the complaints procedure under McNichol, quote, rarely replied or took any action, and the vast majority of times where action did occur, it was prompted by other Labour staff directly chasing this themselves, end quote. Both McNichol and Matthews have denied the claims to Sky News. McNichol called it a, quote, petty attempt to divert attention away from the real issue, end quote. Matthews said the report was, quote, a highly selective retrospective review of the party's poor record, end quote, and that a, quote, proper examination of the full evidence will show that as head of disputes and acting director, I did my best to tackle the poison of anti-Jewish racism, which was growing under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, end quote. But there is too much detail in the report to be easily dismissed, and there remains very serious questions to be answered. For example, once Matthews and McNichol had departed, Labour rapidly increased the resolution of anti-Semitism cases, dramatically stepping up the suspension and expulsion of accused party members. The earlier delays appear to have had one purpose only: to embarrass Corbyn, creating an impression the party, and by implication Corbyn himself, was not taking the issue of anti-Semitism seriously. Anyone who tried to point out what was really going on, such as, for example, MP Chris Williamson, was denounced as an anti-Semitism quote-unquote denier and suspended or expelled. The media happily amplified whatever messages party officials disseminated against Corbyn. That included even the media's liberal elements, such as The Guardian, whose political sympathies lay firmly with the Blairite faction. That was all too evident during a special one-hour edition of Panorama that the BBC's flagship news investigations program on Labour and anti-Semitism last year. It gave an uncritical platform to ex-staff turned supposed, quote, whistleblowers, end quote, who claimed that Corbyn and his team had stymied efforts to root out anti-Semitism. But as the report shows, it was actually these very, quote, whistleblowers, end quote, who were the culpable ones. The media's drumbeat against Corbyn progressively frightened wider sections of the Jewish community, who's assumed there would be no smoke without fire. It was a perfect manufactured moral panic, and once it was unleashed, it could survive the clear-out in 2018 of the Blairite ringleaders of the campaign against Corbyn. Ever since, the anti-Semitism furor has continued to be irregularly stoked into life by the media, by conservative Jewish organizations such as the Board of Deputies, and by Israel partisans inside the Labour Party. Quote, we were being sabotaged and set up left, right and centre by McNichol's team, and we didn't even know. It's so important that the truth comes out, one party source told Sky News. The question now for Labour's new leader, Keir Starmer: what is he going to do with these revelations? Will he use them to clean out Labour's stables, or quietly sweep them audio under the carpet? The signs so far are not encouraging. The intention of current party managers was to bury the revelations until someone foiled them by leaking the report. Predictably, most of the media have so far shown very little interest in giving these explosive findings anything more than the most perfunctory coverage. Unconvincingly, Starmer has claimed he knew nothing about the report until the leak, and that he now intends to conduct an, quote, urgent independent investigation, end quote, into the findings of the earlier inquiry. Such an investigation, he says, will re-examine, quote, the contents and wider culture and practices referred to in the report, end quote. That implies that Starmer refuses to accept the report's findings. A reasonable concern is that he will seek to whitewash them with a second investigation. He has also promised to investigate, quote, the circumstances in which the report was put into the public domain, end quote. That sounds ominously like an attempt to hound those who have tried to bring to light the party's betrayal of its previous leader. The stench of cover-up is already in the air. Most likely, Starmer is desperate to put the anti-Semitism episode behind him and the party. Recent history is his warning. Just as Williamson found himself reviled as an anti-Semite for questioning whether Labour actually had an anti-Semitism problem, Starmer knows that any effort by the party to defend Corbyn's record will simply revive the campaign of smears, and this time he will be the target. Starmer has hurriedly sought to placate Israel lobbyists within and without his own party, distancing himself as much as possible from Corbyn. That has included declaring himself a staunch Zionist and promising a purge of anti-Semites under the IHRA rules that include harsh critics of Israel. Starmer has also made himself and his party hostage to the Conservative Board of Deputies and Labour's Israel partisans by signing up to their 10 Pledges, a document that effectively takes meaningful criticism of Israel off the table. There is very little reason to believe that Labour's new leadership is ready to confront the anti-Semitism smears that did so much to damage the party under Corbyn and will continue harming it for the foreseeable future. The biggest casualties will be truth and transparency. Labour needs to come clean and admit that its most senior officials defrauded hundreds of thousands of party members and millions more supporters who voted for a fairer kind of Britain. Jonathan Cook, a British journalist based in Nazareth since 2001, is the author of 3 books on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. He's a past winner of the Martha Gellhorn Special Prize for Journalism. His website and blog can be found at jonathan-cook.net.